All right, we are joined now by Delano Squires. He's a research fellow over at the Heritage Foundation. He's a contributor to The Blaze. He also spent a long time, and this is relevant for the purposes of this interview, working at the Offices of Gun Violence, the Office of Gun Violence here in Washington, D.C. Such an interesting thinker, totally has a perspective that a lot of people on the right lack on this. So Delano, welcome, and thanks for being willing to talk about this tough topic.
Oh, of course. Thank you for having me.
We're here to discuss the tragic death of Sonya Massey in Springfield, Illinois, which happened earlier this month. And I want to just read from a report that NBC News did. Sonya Massey, 36, called 911 at 12:50 a.m. July 6 to report noises outside her Springfield, Illinois home. Within 15 minutes, two Sangamon County deputies arrived. According to body cam video recorded by his partner, Deputy Sean Grayson rang the doorbell, knocked on the door, and repeatedly identified himself as a deputy from the sheriff's office. Quote, "the one you called." After some delay, Massey opened the door. "Please don't hurt me," she said. He replied, "I won't hurt you." But within minutes, Grayson, who has now been fired and charged by a grand jury with first-degree murder, shot Massey dead. While body cam video recorded how the deputies mishandled their interaction with Massey, Grayson's work history suggests that the Sangamon County Sheriff's Office, let's just say, may not have done their due diligence, Delano. Now, the Massey family attorney is Ben Crump, celebrity attorney. A lot of people will be familiar with Ben Crump. He's represented the families of many people in these situations. I think he said it was the worst police shooting video ever. Do you agree? What happens when you watch this video? Do you think it's the worst ever?
Even framing it that way, has its own issues. I know I saw one from, it was a hotel hallway. I believe the gentleman was in Arizona, where the police were instructing him to crawl and then keep his hands up and then stop and then keep crawling. And he was shot and tragically passed away. But he was white and male, so it didn't really make as many headlines as this one. I don't think there's a need to really compare them. I mean, the shooting looks bad. And obviously the officer was arrested. He will have his day in court. Evidence will be presented, body cam evidence, ballistics, forensics. But it's a bad, it looks bad to the average person. And the average person is deeply troubled when you think of someone calling 911 because they're in a state of distress. And within minutes of making that call, the person is laying on their own floor in their own home, dead with a gunshot to the head. So one thing I will say is this: I'm always curious about the types of charges that police officers receive in these incidents, because I also think there's a danger in potentially overcharging someone, especially if a jury can't deliberate on a lesser charge. So first-degree murder is a very high bar to clear. So it'll be interesting to see what type of evidence the prosecution presents in order to justify that particular charge.
So that's a really good point, because one of the things I was thinking about, this officer, he was discharged from the Army for a, quote, serious offense. He had 2 DUIs in the last 10 years, Grayson. He was immediately fired in this case, but just since 2020, he has had 6 law enforcement jobs, according to that NBC article I was reading from earlier. And that year 2020 really stands out for me, because since 2020, police departments have had a very difficult time recruiting officers and maintaining officers. They have hemorrhaged people to retirements, early retirements. It has been the harassment that people have faced in communities like ours in DC, Delano. We've seen it up close. It's terrible. And in a weird way, that I wonder if that contributed to all of these different departments keeping a guy who seems to have been wildly unqualified for the position of police officer. I want to get your perspective on that and just ask, is that something you've seen happening in communities where, police aren't looked upon super favorably just in the last, 15 or so years?
Well, I've definitely heard, police departments bemoaning the difficulty with recruiting, certainly in a post, if I could put it this way, post BLM, post George Floyd era. So I definitely have heard departments saying, look, our recruitment classes are down, retention is down. As you said, early retirements. I do think some of this is, motivated by both policy and rhetoric. If I am a police officer in a large urban department, and I'm hearing people on my city council talking about playing footsie with defund the police, I may take a job in, a suburb with this, you say hi to the kids and you get a cat down from a tree every once in a while. So I definitely think that's an issue. it is interesting to hear about some of his background because one of the things that happens in a lot of these shootings is that you hear, particularly where race is involved, particularly if it's a white officer and a black suspect, there is a lot of media attention paid to the personal, professional, and oftentimes criminal record of the deceased, and a lot less attention paid to the professional, personal, and sometimes criminal record of the person who's been charged, of the officer. And I do think that that's completely relevant. Now, I don't know under what circumstances he left the other departments, but I certainly think it's worth asking. And I also think that there are some, criminal justice advocates who say this is why we need some type of federal database so that departments can see where a particular officer has worked over a particular period of time. And I don't know if those databases would be open to the public so that the average, American citizen can see, this is the person who's policing in my neighborhood. And I do think that there is an opportunity, even on the center right, to discuss these issues, because one of the things that 2020 did, obviously, you had the riots, you had the civil unrest, but you also had, probably in the first time, certainly in my lifetime, a significant number of conservatives starting to question their back the blue, no matter who sort of rhetoric. Because when it's suburban moms being arrested by police at an outdoor football game because they violated some sort of COVID protocol, it makes you reconsider whether the police, as agents of the state, are always on our quote unquote side. And so I think there's an opportunity for some real robust discussion on some of these issues.
Well, yeah, because what we have in this situation is a single mother who is clearly, I think pretty clearly, she's saying she rebukes this officer in the name of Jesus. There's been some debate about how serious that was, if it was a joke, if it was sort of lighthearted, or if it was really serious. And the officer responds, "You better effing not." And you have her crumpled on the ground, motherless children. As The Atlantic wrote, and we can put this article up on the screen, she may have been seen as a, quote, damsel in distress in another situation. She was responding at first politely to the officers, and the Atlantic writer said that kind of actually reminded her of how a lot of Black Americans are coached to interact with law enforcement. I don't know, Delano, it seems like something that all of these videos, you mentioned Michael Brown earlier, Jacob Blake is one I remember after being sort of duped by all of these clips time after time after time and saying there's no way that nothing else can come out that makes me rethink what happened here. George Floyd is a good example. But this one I'm looking at and I'm like, I have no idea what could possibly make his decision any less callous and disgusting. And so it's a single woman with a pot of boiling water.
Yeah, I'm sure if I can sort of, prognosticate for a little bit, I'm sure the defense attorney will say, they will find some expert to say, well, boiling water can travel at X distance in Y amount of time, and obviously could scald the person and leave them incapacitated. I'm sure someone will say that the camera angle that you see on the video doesn't really give the sort of true sense of danger that officer felt he was in. I think for, again, the average layperson, and I think it's important to make a distinction between people who see these videos on social media and then jurors who are instructed on how to evaluate evidence in a court of law. Because, as you said, we've seen a number of these incidents where you see something and then it's like, okay, well, there's a little bit more to the story to add additional context. Even if it doesn't change your mind, there's more context involved in this particular situation. I think, like you, many people would say, I don't know what context you could give that would go from how this interaction started in terms of her calling the police to how it ended. But I'm sure someone will be there because, everyone's entitled to a defense, and some defense attorney will find a way to say that he felt his life was in mortal danger. There's been dispute as to whether she actually threw the water. Mm-hmm. And now, again, then you end up getting very technical. Throw the water versus the water spilled and ends up on the floor are two different things, all right? So I think there's a lot to be unpacked, and this is why we have courts to adjudicate these types of things. My issue, and again, this is a tragedy regardless of what the legal outcome is. As you said, this is a mom, a daughter, a friend, right? So the people in her life are obviously grieving her loss. My issue is how these incidents tend to be framed in the media. They are primarily made issues of race, which you can do if you only include a certain type of police interaction in sort of the media narrative. And what I like to tell people is that if I came from Mars, I would assume only white blondes go missing and only black people, particularly black men, get shot by the police. Neither of which is true, but this is how things tend to be framed. And I know that there are a number of people, particularly on social media, who see a direct tie-in to the upcoming election because it's okay. Every election cycle, there's going to be one of these cases that gets people thinking, "Oh, I need to vote for this particular party, particularly on the left, in order to enact, criminal justice reform of one type or another." But there are police shootings every single day in this country, vast majority of which people don't hear about. I would wager to say the vast majority are justified because of police interactions with criminal suspects who are armed and dangerous. But there is a subset that we tend to see, and the subset of that subset has a particular narrative that I feel that the media is very much desirous in advancing.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that because I think those media decisions have actual life and death consequences. And I don't want to jump to conclusions on this one, but I think what we were talking about earlier in terms of it being very difficult to recruit police officers, and they'll tell you why. And one of the reasons is snippets of video come out that, as we've seen in multiple instances, snippets of video have come out that are not representative of the actual situation. People's lives are ruined, and they're just trying to, all of the other challenges of being a police officer already existed, and then you layer this on top of it, and it's just an incredibly difficult position to be in. And the Atlantic article I referenced earlier actually mentioned Kamala Harris in the piece. It's clearly being picked up as that kind of framing. But on the right, the most hillbilly thing I think I've ever seen from J.D. Vance is that leaked message from years ago. He said he hates the police. The no-knock warrants were re-explored after the Breonna Taylor killing. It's just a weird time, and it doesn't seem like it's taking off. This particular one is taking off quite like the others have, although that could change. I mean, this is big headline news, but there aren't mass movements in the streets. Maybe it's because the officer was fired. What's your take so far as to how the country is kind of digesting it with those political divides so stark right now?
I certainly see it being discussed online. One of the interesting things is I've seen people take the clip of President Trump saying, if he retakes office, he's going to give police full immunity, and basically tying it to this particular case and say, see, if Trump is back in office, then this officer wouldn't even be charged or arrested. So I definitely see it playing a role in terms of advancing the narrative. I just wish that, and I have a rebuke for both the left and the right on these things. And on the left, it's the fact that these issues are always framed as ones of race, related to race. So because they see an interaction between a black person and a white person, a white officer and a black citizen, they assume that any negative interaction, any negative consequence that comes of that interaction is sort of driven by race. And this happened obviously with George Floyd. It took Keith Ellison, the Attorney General in Minnesota, to say, we did not find any evidence that Officer Chauvin's actions were motivated by race. And he said that, after the trial. By that time, the headline on A1 had already gone out and everybody had already sort of coalesced around that narrative. So I wish instead we would talk about policing honestly, to say that policing is an incredibly difficult job. You're meeting people sometimes at their lowest moments. You're dealing with criminal suspects oftentimes who lie in the same way that they breathe. Police risk their lives every single day, particularly in very sometimes hard to police neighborhoods. But then on the other hand, police officers are agents of the state. They have greater latitude in terms of using force, but with those rights come responsibilities.
So here's my last question then, Delano. What would you say to your fellow Black Americans who see in this video maybe implicit racism, that you have a white officer and a black woman? Is it possible that he wouldn't have shot a white woman who is acting the same way? And this is moving to people, this is enraging to people. And I ask you that also with the context that you mentioned earlier. We've all seen the studies of how, because of media coverage, Americans wildly overestimate the amount of unarmed police shootings of African Americans. And that's because of the media coverage. I mean, there's no other way to explain it when you look at the research. What would you say, if people approached you and said, I know that he wouldn't have done that to a white woman?
Well, the thing that I would say, and I would say this to any person of any background, is that it is much better to focus on actions that can be proven with evidence than to speculate about motives that speak to the inner workings of a person's mind. And one of the reasons I do think that this is important, and specifically as you asked the question, and particularly to Black Americans, is I think about the Tyree Nichols case, right? The young man, I believe, is in Memphis, who was beaten and killed by, I want to say it was 5 officers, all of whom were Black, and they caught it on video, and it was a pretty brutal beating. And one of the first things that came out from CNN, I believe this is from Van Jones, is that, oh, just because these were Black officers doesn't mean that this wasn't motivated by racism. So I think there is this desire to tie certain issues to racism. And I get why individual citizens would be concerned, right? But I believe that the narratives are pushed by craven politicians and activists who want to radically reshape this country and oftentimes reshape Black communities, because these are the people who they take the situations like this one, or Michael Brown or Trayvon Martin, right, who wasn't even killed by an officer. And from there, they argue this institution, policing, which has its roots in, in slavery and slave catching.
Lynch mobs, yeah.
Right, lynch mobs. This institution cannot be reformed. It has to be torn down, abolished, and remade. And one of the things that I learned, and I knew this, but sort of working in the Office of Gun Violence Prevention in DC, where I was a liaison for residents, is that there are few people who want police in their communities more than working class African Americans. Those are the people who say we want them on foot patrol, we want them engaging people. We don't want to be abused. We don't want our sons to be disrespected and to have their crotches grabbed just because they're standing outside of a barbershop and to be dismissed and treated as, would-be criminals. But we don't want what the activists are pushing, which would lead to total dystopia in our neighborhoods. Because for as much as we get the narrative here, the fact of the matter is that for young Black men between 15 and 24, homicide is the leading cause of death at about a 50% rate. So the notion that the police are the main threat to Black lives in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, or Anacostia in DC, or St. Louis, or Chicago, or Atlanta, or New Orleans, or Cleveland, or Detroit is something that is not supported by evidence. And that is my major frustration, particularly with progressives with respect to how they use these cases, because to them, Black lives are only valuable and only matter when they're politically useful.
Yeah, and sadly, I suspect we'll find out that he was hired by all of these police departments despite such a horrific and spotted record, because they were just desperate for people in the aftermath of what's been, I think, exploitation by activists, as you detailed just there, Delano. Fascinating and helpful as usual. Delano Squires, Heritage Foundation, and a contributor over at The Blaze. Make sure to give him a follow. Thank you for joining us, Delano.
Thank you, Emily.